One day in college, I was sitting with some friends by the river and I started to have a panic attack. This had never happened to me before, so it totally freaked me out. The river was flowing really fast, and one of my friends threw a rock across it, and that's when it happened. My whole body just started shaking, and the sun felt too bright, and I just wanted to scream. After I calmed down, I grabbed my bag and went back to my dorm. I was so embarrassed, and I just needed to be alone for a bit. You see, all I wanted was to fit in. My whole life, I'd been bounced around between foster homes, and only once I reached college did I finally have a room of my own. The first day was really hard, though. Everyone's parents were dropping them off and helping them unpack, and I had no one. I guess you could say I'm an orphan. My mom died giving birth to me, and then my memories go kinda hazy, but there was an accident of some sort, and then I don't remember much. I must have knocked my head really badly because I don't know what happened to my dad. The man who found me after the accident and looked after me said my dad had died in the accident. I was so young at the time, so I didn't really understand. The only thing that sticks in my mind is that we all spoke Spanish together, and we laughed a lot. But the first foster home I was in said that wasn't a real memory, and that my name was Sarah, and I was clearly an English-speaking American. Well, now I was in college studying Spanish as a major, and my professor said I was the best student he'd ever had. I was so good that he came to me one day and said there was a summer program where I could go to Mexico and live with a host family and properly immerse myself in the language and culture. I told him I couldn't afford it, and he said he could arrange a bursary for me. I was so relieved, mainly because I had no plan of where to stay during the vacation time. I definitely wasn't going back to the foster home, and it's not like I had any family to go to. I just hoped the panic attacks stopped before then. Ever since that day at the river, they'd been getting worse and worse. I'd gone to the pool to watch my boyfriend in a swimming competition, and one guy had slipped and fallen in the pool, and I just watched in horror. I could barely breathe, and I think I panicked more than the guy. My boyfriend told me I needed to seriously chill out, and when I told him about the Mexico program, he said I should go for it. I thought he'd be sad that I would be gone for the summer, but he said he'd come visit me near the end and we could travel around together. A few days before I was due to leave, I got really nervous. I'd never traveled anywhere before, but I knew I had to do this. There was another girl, Alana, going with me, but she'd be staying with another host family. When we got there, the director of the program picked us up and drove us to our new homes for the summer. We dropped Alana off first, and I was so glad I wasn't in her position. It looked like her host family were dirt poor. Their house was tiny. I'd already seen photos of where I'd be staying, and it was definitely nicer, even better than some of the foster homes I'd been in. My host parents were waiting for me outside, and when they saw me, they came running over and started hugging me. It was so weird for me. I wasn't used to affection. They showed me around, and I was kind of disappointed it was just me and them. I was hoping for a host sister or brother. Alana at least had a host brother. She'd already texted me saying that he was a babe and that it didn't matter if they were poor, at least she had eye candy. She said we could all hang out the next day after class, and then I could meet him. At dinner that first night, my host parents kept looking at me, saying I looked like I belonged here, and they asked me if I felt at home. You know what? I did feel at home. The only thing bothering me was the sound of the river nearby. It was so loud, and I started to feel quite anxious. I was so tired after the flight, though, so I needed to sleep. A little while after I'd gone to bed, I heard voices. It must have been my host dad's friend. He sounded drunk, and I could hear him chatting away with my host dad for hours. At some point in the night, I heard my door open. I woke up straight away and realized the drunk man was standing there. I sat upright and asked what he wanted. Then he quickly walked out and said he was just looking for the bathroom. After that, I couldn't sleep. I was so creeped out. The next day was our first day of class, and Alana walked in with a big grin on her face. She winked at me and said that her and her host brother had gotten close last night, and that she hadn't had much sleep. I couldn't believe it. Her trip was way more exciting than mine so far, but at least my boyfriend was coming to visit in a month. After a whole day of classes, I was exhausted, but Alana's host brother Pedro was waiting outside to take us on a tour of the town. I introduced myself, and he wouldn't stop staring at me. I could see Alana was getting uncomfortable. She even hit him on the arm and said, "Why not just take a picture? It'll last longer." And then he laughed and said, "Sorry, she just looks so familiar." It was pretty odd. He kept staring at me the whole afternoon. Eventually, Alana said she was feeling sick and asked to go home, and Pedro dropped her off. Then he said he'd drive me home too because it was too hot to walk. Alana, of course, was not happy about this and gave me an evil glance as she got out. I had to ask him to keep his eyes on the road as he was constantly staring at me. Listen, Pedro, I have a boyfriend. I'm not single, okay? And he laughed and said he wasn't attracted to me. I just looked like someone he used to go to school with. Then he asked about my family, and I said it was just me, and he looked confused. What do you mean, just you? He asked. And I explained I'd spent my whole life in foster homes and didn't have a family. Then he reached out and gave me a hug and said, "We are your family now." Wow, these Mexicans were full on. I mean, I just met this guy today. The next day was my birthday, and I thought maybe Alana and I could do something fun to celebrate. But then Alana arrived at class with her suitcase. I apologized for the day before, thinking she was leaving because she thought Pedro liked me, but it turned out to be much worse. Her mom was sick and she needed to go back to America. I couldn't believe it. We'd only been here one day. I wasn't ready to be here all on my own. After classes finished, Pedro was taking Alana to the airport, and Alana turned to me and said, "Just remember you have a boyfriend, Sarah." Then she left without saying goodbye or happy birthday. Unbelievable. Well, I hoped her mom would be okay at least. I went home and my host parents were waiting with a big cake and balloons, and I was so happy to see them. I assumed it was just the three of us celebrating, but then the creepy drunk man from the day before appeared, and he looked so grumpy. Great, not what I wanted on my birthday. When my host parents started singing happy birthday, he walked out. He was so rude. I looked at my host dad and he just shrugged his shoulders and apologized. He said it was a difficult day for his friend. The rest of the evening, he just stayed outside smoking and looking at the river. It was so... I offered him a piece of cake and he just asked me to leave him alone. When I came back inside, I asked my host parents what his problem was, and they told me his daughter had died years ago and he'd never really recovered. I knew that must have been hard, but I'd lost my whole family and I wasn't going around being mean to people. Why today, of all days? It was my birthday, which meant it was also the day my mom had died, so it wasn't an easy day for me either. After that, I just wanted to be on my own, so I went to bed and called my boyfriend. A little while later, I heard someone singing and I got goosebumps. I knew that song. It was one of my favorite Spanish songs, and I realized it was coming from outside. I peered outside my window and couldn't believe it. It was the grumpy guy singing. I felt kind of bad for how I'd complained about him to my boyfriend, so I went downstairs and told him I liked the song and that he had a nice voice. He was clearly drunk again because he just looked at me. I thought he'd at least say thanks, but I realized he'd been crying, and then he just walked off. I decided to follow him. I was so worried he'd fall in the river or something. "Hey, let me walk with you," I called after him. I then caught up with him and grabbed his arm just before he tripped and fell. There was something about this man that made me curious, especially because of that song. I hadn't listened to it in years because it always made me emotional. I wanted to make him feel better, so I told him today wasn't the best day for me either. I didn't think he was really listening, but I felt like I could connect with this man. We both lost people we loved, and that wasn't easy. We reached the river, and he still hadn't spoken to me. He didn't even acknowledge what I'd said. He just sat down, lit up a cigarette, and then started crying. He was saying something about how she would have been 19 years old today and how it was all his fault. I asked him what he meant, and he said he'd been the reason she'd died. And then he told me his son had also left him, that he'd gone to live in another city because he couldn't stand being around his grumpy father. I mean, I couldn't blame the son, but also that's hard. Now he was here all alone, and I definitely know what that feels like. Suddenly, he just got up and walked away, and I decided to sit by the river for a bit. It was really late, but for some reason there were still some kids playing on the other side of the river. Out of nowhere, I felt that tightness in my chest again. Why was this happening? I really felt like I couldn't breathe, so I lay down and tried to take deep breaths. And then it hit me. Another full-on panic attack. I must have passed out because the next moment I was waking up in some kind of hospital bed and my host parents were there holding my hands. The doctor came in and said I'd be okay and that maybe I just fell and knocked my head, but I knew that wasn't what had happened. I just didn't know how to tell him that water made me anxious and gave me panic attacks. It must have been about 2 a.m. by that point, and I told my host parents to go home and get some sleep, but they said no way, they weren't leaving my side. Suddenly, I wondered who'd found me, and they said it was Manuel. "Who's Manuel?" I asked, and they laughed and said, "Our old grumpy friend, didn't he tell you his name?" It dawned on me that I hadn't even bothered to ask his name. I couldn't believe he'd saved me like that. "Where is he?" I asked, and they said he'd been in shock and gone home. He hated hospitals, too many bad memories, and I couldn't argue with that. When I got out of the hospital later that morning, I went home to rest at my host parents', and Manuel was there. He was carrying some flowers, and he apologized for treating me badly. I told him it was okay and thanked him for saving me, and then he asked if I wanted to see photos of his little girl. Before I could even reply, he pulled out an album and started showing me baby photos, and then the last one he ever took of this girl, and it felt like I was about to have another panic attack. Except it wasn't because I was anxious. The little girl in the photos was me. I honestly couldn't breathe, and I heard Manuel shouting for my host parents that it was happening again. I couldn't stop crying. It all came back to me that day at the river. We'd been so poor, and the bridge across the river had been destroyed in a flood. Dad cared so much about getting us to school on time that he put us inside these big plastic bags so we wouldn't get wet and carried us across the river. But then, one day, the current had been really strong and I'd been pulled out of my dad's arms. "That's me," I somehow managed to say through my tears. And then I looked at Manuel, really looked at him, and it was him. It was my dad. I knew it. And then I started singing the song he'd been singing the day before, the song he always sang to me and my brother when we couldn't get to sleep at night. The whole time, Manuel was just looking at me, and my host parents were suddenly crying too, and I've never seen a grown man cry like that before. He came over to me and started clinging onto me, saying, "It's really you, isn't it? I wanted to believe you were still alive, but this is like a miracle. I can't believe it." That day turned out to be the craziest day of my life. I came to Mexico to work on my Spanish, and now I was being reunited with my dad, who I thought had died. We went to the hospital to do a DNA test to check, and the police were there too. And when we got the result that proved Manuel was my dad, we were jumping around, crying and laughing, and I felt like I was truly at home for the first time in my life. The police filed a report and said that 14 years ago there had been some cases of kidnappings, and that they'd lost track of them once they'd entered America. I was obviously one of those unlucky kids. Probably someone had found me washed up by the river and decided to chance their luck. In the end, I decided to stay in Mexico. My degree could wait, but spending another minute away from my dad couldn't. We had so many years to catch up on. I thought I was an orphan, but actually, I had a father all along. And a brother, too. In fact, the whole town became like family to me, with everyone celebrating the fact that I was alive and well. The police are still trying to figure out what happened all those years ago, and I hope the person gets caught. But for now, I just want to enjoy every moment of being home. I found out my real name is Maria, so I let Sarah go. And my dad gave me my brother's number. Let me tell you, that was an emotional call to make. He's flying home soon, and I cannot wait to see him again. Oh, and Pedro had actually gone to school with me all those years ago. That's why he'd been staring at me. Unfortunately, my boyfriend broke up with me when he found.
Hi, my name's Amelia, and recently I had to make the most difficult decision of my life. Even now, just thinking about it, I feel like I could burst into tears. Up until last year, my life was so carefree and chilled, and then out of nowhere, both of my twin sisters got sick at exactly the same time. I was the only one who could save them. I mean, that's a pretty terrifying thing. But there's more. You see, I could only save one of them, and so that's where my story begins. My family has always been that stereotypical perfect family. My parents are still crazy in love with each other, and me and my sisters are like best friends. I have two sisters, Beth and Carly, and they're identical twins. They're only 3 years younger than me, and you'd think I'd feel a bit left out sometimes because they have that whole twin thing going on. But they treat me like I'm one of them, which is great. Last year, we vowed to spend a lot of time together because I was going to be heading to college on the other side of the country. My dad planned this epic road trip, and a week before we were due to go, Beth started feeling really unwell. She woke up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, and her fever was sky high. By the time morning came, Carly started complaining that her stomach hurt, and pretty soon, she had a fever too. It was a Sunday, so we drove to the hospital to try and get an emergency appointment. As soon as the nurse at reception saw them, she rushed them into a private room in the hospital. The skin on their face was starting to turn a slight shade of yellow, and that's when we realized something was seriously wrong. This wasn't just flu. A few hours later, after a lot of blood tests and painfully waiting for the results, the head doctor informed us that Beth and Carly were suffering from a rare form of liver disease, and that it had probably been developing ever since their birth. Mom burst into tears and started blaming herself. When she'd fallen pregnant with the twins, she hadn't known, and she'd worked on a wine estate, so she'd been constantly tasting and reviewing new wines. When she found out she was pregnant, she was paranoid that all the wine would affect their health. Dad was comforting her, telling her of course it wasn't her fault. I could see how upset Dad was too, but he was trying to hold it together for Beth and Carly. They were devastated, of course, although I don't think they truly understood what it all meant. The doctors left us so we could have some private family time. We managed to calm Mum down, and Dad even cracked a joke and got us all laughing. We were still giggling when the head doctor walked back in with a grim expression on his face. My heart sunk. He looked like he was about to tell us that somebody had died. He pulled up a seat and asked us all to sit down. I could see Mom getting teary again, and so I grabbed her hand and held it tightly. The doctor told us that there was some more news, and he didn't know how to tell us. I looked at Beth and Carly. I would have done anything to make them better. Little did I know, that was about to become an actual reality for me a moment later. Turns out, Beth and Carly's disease was a lot more critical than we thought, and that their only chance of survival would be if they could find two donors who would be willing to donate part of their liver. I couldn't believe it. My baby sisters needed transplants. I immediately jumped up and said, I'll do it. I'll do it right now. Take my liver, please. Just save my sisters. I couldn't stop crying. I felt like our whole world was crumbling. And yet, Beth and Carly were so strong through all of this. They just lay there, comforting each other, whilst Mum and I were a mess. Dad got to work straight away. He started contacting all our family. Cousins, aunts, uncles, even second cousins. Everyone was heartbroken to hear the news, and they all rushed to do blood tests to find out if they would be a match for the twins. Once we'd stopped crying, Mum and I went off to do the tests. I didn't even want to leave my sisters alone in that room. What if they died before we even got the results? So many thoughts were running through my head. I'm terrified of needles. It's like my biggest phobia, but I didn't even feel this one. My mind was so far away, I might as well have been on another planet. The results came out quick. Unfortunately, Mom's liver wasn't stable enough to make her a suitable donor, and nor was Dad's. The doctors informed us that this was normal due to their age, etc. I was crossing all of my fingers and toes as a nurse walked in to hand the doctor my results. You're a match, he said. I had to have him repeat this because I couldn't believe what he was saying. The relief was so overwhelming that I actually ran up to him and started hugging him. I could save my sisters and everything would go back to normal. The transplant surgery would only take a day, but the recovery process was at least a month. Dad had obviously canceled our vacation, but then I realized something else. I couldn't go to college. I'd missed the first 2 weeks, and what if the surgery went wrong? No, I needed to be here and help my sisters recover. I tried to put all negative thoughts out of my head and focus on the positive. Later that day, I called the admissions department of my college and informed them I'd have to defer until the following year. They completely understood and sent their good wishes for my sisters. Even though I knew it was the right decision, it still killed me that I wouldn't be going to college at the same time as all my friends. I'm the most indecisive person in the world, so I'm surprised I made that decision so quickly. The doctors scheduled the surgery for the following month. They couldn't afford to wait any longer because Beth was especially struggling, but they wanted to make sure everything was in place. They needed to keep an eye on me to make sure my health was okay for the transplant to be successful. The slightest problem with my liver, and they wouldn't be able to do it. Every day I had to go for blood tests to check my liver. Beth and Carly were stable, and even though they have to stay in the hospital, we still had a fun time together, watching movies, and loads of their friends visited. About a week before the scheduled surgery date, the doctor called me. I was over at my friend Amy's house at the time. As soon as I heard what he said, I rushed to the hospital. My parents were already waiting there. This next bit of news was like a punch to the chest. After a lot of research, the doctors had discovered that if I wanted to live a long and healthy life, I could only donate a very small part of my liver, which meant that I could only donate enough to save one of my sisters. I felt like I was going to pass out. No one else had been a correct match so far, which meant that I was the only one who could save my sisters. And now, here I was, being told that actually I could only save one of them. I didn't want to deal with this. I was only 17 years old. Why was I having to make such a life-altering decision? I wasn't even an adult yet. Mom and Dad held me and told me everything would be okay and that they were sure they would find another donor. But I had to make my decision quickly. I walked to my sister's room. When I walked in, I could tell they already knew. It's obvious they knew her name. Fear pulsed through me. There was no way I could make this decision. They weren't just my sisters, they were my best friends. Beth, who was slightly more sick than Carly, told me to pick Carly. And Carly told me I had to choose Beth because Beth needed the help more. I ran out of the hospital. They could figure it out. I knew what I needed to do. Either way, it felt like my life was over. I was supposed to be at college with my friends. Instead, I was left with the responsibility of choosing which of my sisters I would save. The next week passed by in a blur. Before I knew it, the day of surgery had arrived. Beth and Carly had chosen which of them I would save, and they weren't going to tell me until after the surgery. I was put under an anesthetic, and afterwards the surgeon was persuaded. It had gone successfully. But who would I save? Which sister? And what about the other one? I would need to stay in hospital for at least a week to recover, but I needed some fresh air, so I started walking towards the main entrance. I felt slightly dizzy from the anesthetic, so at first I didn't even notice my dad standing by the reception. There was some kind of commotion happening, and my dad was speaking to a woman who looked very similar to him, just much younger. In fact, she looked closer to my age than his. Who was she? Well, that's when things really hit the fan because I was not prepared for what happened next. My dad had got his high school sweetheart pregnant, and this woman standing in the hospital was his daughter. I couldn't believe it. As my dad explained this all to me, I honestly thought I'd snap. First of all, how had my dad kept this a secret for all these years? Second of all, what on earth was she doing here at a time like this? I so badly wanted to hate her, but she saved us big time. My dad had reached out to her when we needed donors for Beth and Carly. Now she was here because her blood tests had shown she was also a perfect match. She could save the other twin. When I heard this, I wanted to hug her. I didn't even have time to be angry at my dad because all I could think about was how both of my sisters would survive. And now we had a fourth sister too. This was crazy. So in the end, it all worked out. Sally, our new stepsister, saved Carly's life, and I saved Beth's. I want to say that